Well, welcome everyone to another edition of our infamous podcast where we solve all of the world's problems. No, we don't. I'm just kidding. But
solve some, cause some.
Mostly cause more problems. But anyway, we are. What week are we? Are we 4?
Week 4.
Week 4.
Week 4 of 7.
Week 4 of 7 of our Better Together series. Kind of directions that we're going for our entire church. And so, Mara, why don't you catch us up where we've been on this series?
Yeah, so basically this vision that we've kind of had as a staff for like what we want moving forward is this idea of God has called us to this ever-expanding, ever-deepening community. And we really feel like church is one of the best ways that we can express that and really live into it, that it's supposed to be getting bigger, that ever-expanding as we are looking to include other people, but not just to make those shallow connections, those things that just kind of crack and fade with time, but those ever-deepening things where we really are joined together with one mind, one purpose going forward. But that kind of asks a lot of us. We're looking for, if your relationships are getting deeper, that's going to take time. That's an investment. And that can be really scary, especially if you've been in relationships in the past where you've been hurt in those. And so we want the church to be a place of healing, but that doesn't mean that we can neglect that God really is calling us to communities that are growing and getting deeper.
Good. I think that's fascinating too. That when I really hadn't think about it until he was saying it right there. That's a hard thing to do. I mean, it's easy to say, okay, we want to be ever expanding. In other words, we're always including people. But then, how do you still go deep as well? And so that's a tension in the church.
Sure.
That's always there, because the deeper you go into relationships, oftentimes what happens is that you become closed to other relationships. I don't know where it's going.
So
with
let's solve that today.
Yeah.
When we solve all the problems, let's solve that.
Jesus.
Jesus.
I mean, it is. It's a miraculous thing. I mean,
doubt.
it's what makes the church different. And when Paul talks about the church being, all the differences in the church, either Jew or Gentile, and all those kind of things, he's talking about these differences in the church that would tend to restrict vulnerability and connection and deepening connection and intimacy, and yet somehow God can move even in those circumstances to a deeper relationship.
For sure.
And so I understand as a pastor, as I'm preaching this, there should be pushback, because this is not natural or easy.
Right.
That we tend, if we want to go deep in relationship, we tend to stay small in our connection points. And so I think it's important that when we think about the church, that this is important what we do, and I'm pointing towards the sanctuary. What we do in the sanctuary is important in there. But if we're not building circles as well, that's probably easier to build greater connections and widening connection,
right,
or expanding. But it's not always conducive to deepening connections.
Yeah. It takes a lot of intentionality on both, right? Because man, it's so easy to go to just one extreme or the other, and figuring out how to do both is that's significant. And understanding that not everything that we do is meant to be both, right? Like, we do some things as a church that are about maybe that widening, and other things more for that deepening,
Right.
Which is a good. I'm just thinking like that. That's a good thing to. It's a good thing to evaluate why we do what we do and the things that we do as a church, and are we accomplishing one of those? And
Well, and it's a lot when you think about discipleship. Discipleship is not just this. Okay, discipleship is when I'm teaching the Bible. Discipleship is a wide gambit of activities, and I truly believe discipleship begins even before someone makes a commitment to Christ. I think there's discipleship that happens there, and so when you're thinking about this ever expanding, ever deepening relationships, I think that wherever you find yourself, all these things can be going on. I mean, you could be connecting to newer people,
for sure.
and in that relationship, it could be growing closer.
Yeah, good. Well, we just dove right in there, without kind of touching on what we touched on Sunday. So, Paul, why don't you re-preach your sermon
Okay.
for us in 30 seconds or less.
Be vulnerable. No, we,
Well
we,
done.
we used a formula: time plus vulnerability equals deepening community, and I think that's a pretty good, simple way of looking at it. That if you spend time with people and you open yourself up to other people, then your relationship can grow deeper. And I don't think that is a one size fits all. I got socks for Christmas, or actually we got in a white elephant gift exchange. I ended up with some socks, and the sock says, one size fits most, which I thought was kind of funny. But this is a one size fits all in that wherever you are in relationship, if you give time and you give ever more vulnerability, then your relationship will deepen. It'll happen.
Yeah. I got slippers for Christmas. I asked for slippers for
They're nice.
Christmas, and it was at that moment where I was like,
You're old.
I am old.
Yeah.
I just put slippers on my Christmas list.
Yeah.
Anyway, side note.
That makes me feel better about the slippers I got Ryan for Christmas.
They're great. I love them. Anyway, moving on. I should have worn them today. What? So we're talking time plus vulnerability equals deepening community. What do we mean by vulnerable? By being vulnerable? What's that look like? What's that mean? And you can't use the word vulnerable to describe vulnerability.
I mean, I think it goes to that ideal of being comfortable being fully known. Like being, you guys are going to laugh because I feel like I always talk about podcasts or things I was listening to. But this was actually somebody telling me about a podcast. But they said there was this difference between the idea of transparency and vulnerability. And that sometimes we push them together and mean that and say that they're the same thing. But there's really two different parts. Like if you're transparent, she was arguing that kind of means that you're just more willing to be honest about your past. You aren't hiding where you came from. You aren't sugarcoating certain situations in your life. But vulnerability is really being honest about where you are right now. And so sometimes people can feel like, well, I've told you my whole life story. I've been guilty of this. Been like, I haven't kept anything from you. I've been so transparent. And I've had friends push back and be like, but you're not telling me about right now. I have no idea what's going on in your head right now. And realizing that piece of I want you to know about me, but I'm not sure if I want you to fully know me, is I feel like where that vulnerability piece comes in.
I think I used in the sermon the phrase authentic, and there's there's two parts to that. There's me being willing to be authentic and you allowing me to be authentic. That you're not trying to change me instantly. If I say this is where I'm at, you find that a lot in the church. Somebody will say, "Well, I'm struggling with this," and oftentimes instantly we want to throw scripture at them and change where they are authentically feeling. And I think that the danger of that is when we do that, the other person begins to think, "Well, I'm not going to share that because instantly they're just going to try to change me."
Right.
And that's kind of how I feel right now.
That's so that just. So maybe, I don't know how to steer this the way that I have in my mind. I'm thinking of vulnerability, and so then I'm thinking of obstacles to vulnerability. And so just in thinking, what is vulnerable? How do we be vulnerable? I re-listened to the Brene Brown TED Talk of vulnerability. I don't remember what the title is.
Pretty good.
But
Pretty
yeah,
good
it's
talk.
definitely worth the 20 minutes or so to watch that. But she talked about worthiness, and to be vulnerable is to understand your worthiness. And so, like, I'm able to be vulnerable because I understand my self-worth. We talked about it, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago on our podcast. This idea of knowing what our self-worth is and knowing that that God, the way that God sees us. I don't remember exactly how our conversation went, but I'm just thinking through this. And you presented this scenario where someone says, I'm struggling with this, and our automatic response is to kind of throw a Band-Aid scripture at it to fix it. How does that affect our worthiness? Because in my mind, that's like saying, like, well, you're not worthy right now until you fix this. And so here I'm going to throw this Band-Aid at you to fix it, and then you'll be worthy. And so then what does that do, man? That shuts down any desire for me to be vulnerable right away, because you've said that I'm not worthy until I fix this. So maybe I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or just other obstacles to being vulnerable that we come across.
I think the worthiness, I can't say it, the worthiness, worthiness that she talks about. I want to put an L in there. I'm not worthy. That she talks about is so important, and self-acceptance is another way I would phrase that. And and I want to be careful how I phrase this. I do and I don't. The reality is, God didn't reject us; we rejected God.
Yeah, that's right.
That God lives in this constant state of, hey, I accept you. Come. Jesus says we're accepted. There's one scripture in the Bible that calls humankind a worm. And so it's in a song, so we think, oh, well, we're such a worm as I. That is not how God sees us.
That's right.
God does not see us as worms, as unworthy. The best picture of how God sees us when we've rejected him is prodigal son.
Absolutely.
And so, we live in this state of we are worthy of the love of God. The question is whether we will step into to that worthiness.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, because we do, like, a lot of times we use language that paints us like as a worm, or just totally unworthy and just scum of the earth, really. Like we paint that picture a lot of times with like total depravity and things like that. But yeah, that's not.
Well,
that's good.
And it really, I think it diminishes God. Mm-hmm. If I were to give Wyatt for a worm, that's the craziest thing in the world.
Yeah.
To give a son for a worm. God didn't give his son for a worm. He gave his son for other children that he loved.
Right.
And I don't know if that helps in being vulnerable, but I think where it helps is we start from this default point of God loves me. Mm-hmm. And I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I am created in his image. And if there's rejection being done, it starts with me, not with him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think there's also that piece of sometimes thinking that unworthy is the same as undeserving, and like saying like we've done nothing to earn any of this. So
absolutely.
I think that there is very much that feeling sometimes of like, I did nothing to deserve this. We are all equally undeserving of this, but also equally worthy and loved by him. So I think sometimes we're like, well, everybody's worthy. Like, well, but you're not identifying this feeling that I'm feeling where I don't deserve this. Yeah. And I think that we can kind of speak into that. But I think with the vulnerability and with the feeling like, oh, is it worth it? Or am I worthy of your attention and if I share my problems with you? When we sell them a quick fix, I feel like that takes away their opportunity to be honest with us the next time we see them. That maybe they're still struggling with that. And so they expect, wait, if that quick fix was supposed to fix this, then there is something really wrong with me. And now I'm more worried that I need to keep that a secret because that quick fix didn't work for me.
That's good. For sure. So I don't know. My mind just like to talk about being vulnerable. Like we got to talk about why we're not vulnerable. So maybe this question will kind of go there. As you've matured, as you've gotten older, have you grown more or less vulnerable?
I think, and I talk about this later, and maybe, or it's in the notes later. As children, I think you're more vulnerable than as adults. So something happens to us along the way that I believe begins to impede vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's we get a brain and we realize that we don't have to tell everybody what we're thinking right at that. I mean, maybe there's some sense in that. Yeah. Maybe some.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So maybe there is some that's good about that. But I know, hurt. Sharing and realizing that someone is not keeping your confidence. I think anytime you're in leadership, I'll be vulnerable here.
Please do.
Somebody comes to me after a sermon and says, hey, great sermon. I always take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And it's, I appreciate it, but it's always, okay, sure. Right.
Yeah, right.
And I think that is because in leadership, oftentimes what's said to you is not what's said about you.
That's right.
And you learn that. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's the reality of position at times.
Absolutely.
And you both are now in leadership positions, and Mara, it's a little bit of a different leadership position, and I'm sure that you've seen some of that in this short time, or the 2 years. I guess it's not been that short of a time now.
No, it's so interesting. I actually came across a document that I think I did right after I got hired here, talking about some of my strengths or like areas that I thought would be more of a struggle or a growing space. And reading between the lines, I feel like that vulnerability piece was definitely woven in there. And for me, I feel like, there was definitely, as a kid, you're super honest, and then you reach that point where you realize that you don't have to be that honest. You can conceal things. And so sometimes parents freak out when their kids start lying. And I mean, it's the most like otherworldly experience when you're watching your kid just up and down tell you something that is just flat out not true, but because they really think that
Your kids lie to you?
I know. No, I've been blessed that has not been a huge hurdle for us at times. But just that moment where you're going, I know that you're lying, but especially when they're both, like, two of them are in on it, and you go, but I don't know which one of you is. Like, I know that somebody is. But as I've grown, especially I feel like over the last few years, I have just realized how much it has cost me in the places where I have not been vulnerable, and I should have. And I've realized that where it's cost me in relationships, where people made assumptions about me based on the way I presented myself because I was being inauthentic in what I was saying or how I was showing myself to the world. And so it has been very difficult for me at times because I've realized what inauthenticity or lack of vulnerability has cost me, and I'm paying for that still, but I'm also like, I don't want to keep making deposits there. So just to be totally honest, this is definitely an area where I'm like, okay, I'm tired of paying for those mistakes, and I don't want to keep going there.
That's good. I'm thinking of the kids and as we grow older, and I think there's that element of shame, which ties so much into the creation story in the fall.
And Brittany Brown, she talks about shame a lot.
for sure,
daring greatly,
for sure. So just that, like, man, when you're a kid, like, there is no shame, right? Like, you're just living. You have no awareness of what other people are thinking about you, and so there is just no shame. But there is, and so it parallels the story of Adam and Eve, where like there's that moment of realization that that you are vulnerable, and then there's that shame aspect. So it just makes sense that as you get older, as you mature, maybe you don't get worse at being vulnerable, but it takes a whole lot more work to be vulnerable. So for my answer for my question, I don't know how to fully reconcile this, but as I'm thinking through this, like, I found that as I've matured, being vulnerable with God has become so much easier, but being vulnerable with people has become much more difficult. In other words, so like when we're talking about worthiness, like, man, I've never been so sure of my worthiness to God. Even as I say that sounds really like man, I've got to go on. Yeah, but like, I'm fully convinced that that's who God is, and that's how God sees us. I'm fully convinced in that, and so like, there's no like at this point, there's very little like questioning of my worthiness before God, but like worthiness to other people is a bigger struggle. Part of that, I think, comes into our positions. Like, we're on staff, we're seen as pastors, and so like, you like feeling like I'm supposed to think and feel one way, but does that make sense? So it like I said, I don't really know how to reconcile this, but like, I'm feeling like, in terms of worthiness before God, like I'm convinced of that, but like, when it comes to worthiness to other people, like, that's a struggle.
Is it a question of worthiness or trust?
Yes.
Because see, I don't struggle with worthiness. I don't know why I have trouble saying that word. I don't struggle with that so much, but I do struggle with trust.
Yeah.
Can I trust somebody with this? Can this be misused?
Yeah.
And so I understand
Yeah,
the
no, that makes
worthiness
sense.
of it, but there is, I mean, the reality of it is, as a pastor, there's expectations, you know, and I don't want people to listen to this podcast. I know pastors has no faith and he's out sinning, but I don't share every thought on my mind.
Sure.
Because I don't, you know, there is a position
Absolutely.
that you have to be concerned about,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it can be misused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably a good distinction there of the trust and just, or even, so maybe it's trust, maybe it's worthiness of like living up to expectations, or like this is who you're supposed to be, or this is, you know, does that make sense? So I don't know if that's a trust thing or a worthiness thing, but
And even trusting yourself, you know, as I'm thinking about it, I mean, there's things that you, as we're sitting here thinking about what we're saying here, I mean, there's directions we could go that you know, I'm not sure if I've sorted that out in my mind enough to go that direction. I mean, you know, so you know, you don't share everything because sometimes it's still forming in your mind
Sure.
and your theology
Sure.
and God's conversations with you.
yeah, absolutely.
I feel like we went way off on a rabbit trail there.
It's good though. I mean, it's the reality of vulnerability and obstacles and things like that. So
I do think there's a lot of this that does just goes back to the fall. I mean, and so you see this, you know, they're unwilling to be vulnerable, unwilling to be seen in the fall, and it makes, you know, we talk about the effect of the fall. Well, is the effect of the fall self-perpetuating? In other words, is their lack of vulnerability, their lack of commitment to relationship, their lack of willingness to be seen by God, of receiving each other properly, is that the cause of all these relational things that you see later on? That's not God saying, hey, I'm going to curse you now with this, but you've chosen this path, and then choosing this path, there's this pain and there's all this struggle that you're going to have to go through.
Yeah.
And somehow you've got to come back to this point where you allow me to see you, that you understand that I see you as worthy, that I want to accept you. And I really hadn't worked that out completely in my mind, but I think there's a lot of that in the story.
Yeah. No, I was thinking, like, just prior to the fall, when he talks about, like, them living together. And I mean, it goes so far as to point out, to make sure everybody knows, like, they weren't wearing any clothes. But, like, depending on which translation you're, like, either it says, like, they were unashamed, or there was no shame, or they had no shame. And so I think that the fall introduced that feeling of shame. I mean, I feel like that has been one of the biggest repercussions of that. And what has been hard, and I think we see this over and over through history as we're reading through the Bible, is this idea of us not knowing what to do with that shame. Instead of seeing that shame as something that points us to being fully known and fully loved by God, we see that shame as a part of us that we need to kill off and numb and hide. And I mean, even to the point now, you look around in our culture right now, shame is the enemy. It is your enemy. And if you are feeling ashamed, you should not. Nothing should be able to make you feel that way. Like, we talk about all these ways that we can help other people to feel no shame, but we aren't really talking about pointing them towards the actual way that we feel unashamed, which is in the presence of God. And so when we talk about shame and what that does to us, I just think that we're missing the mark when we don't see it as a symptom of our need for God, but instead just like the symptom of our human nature that we just have to wrestle with on our own.
And isn't it true, though, and I'm really struggling whether I should say this or not, in the church, shame's been used so often that oftentimes in churches I've grown up in, and maybe in this church, I don't know, I hope not, too often we use shame as a way to shape people. And maybe that's a wrong direction.
We unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I just want to hear more about what you're
What I'm saying is we tend to guilt people into things more than draw people into things. That if you don't give, if you're not serving in this way, if you're not vulnerable enough, that we use shame to direct people, as opposed to a call to wholeness, to being authentic and allowing God to make the changes. I don't know if I can develop it anymore because it just hit me that
That's good.
and that is a from people outside the church. They look at a church and say, I don't need more shame.
Yeah, for sure.
And you'll have people that won't come to church because they've been shamed enough, and they see churches as shame festivals. And I don't know what the balance is there, because there is, conviction is this ideal that, hey, this isn't wrong, and God's calling me to more.
So are you saying, because I'm here hearing you and I'm thinking, so we aren't maybe necessarily saying these are the wrong conversations, but maybe that they're happening between the wrong people, it's happening outside of a deep, vulnerable relationship. People maybe feeling like, without even knowing someone very well, that they can come in, like, in effect, speak conviction on you, that you should be doing this, you should be doing this. And if it's not coming from that place of of a relationship, that maybe that is where, like, you're using guilt, but you're not really talking with someone through about maybe what shame they are feeling. Does that make sense?
I think there's some truth in that, and I think there's also some truth in the ideal that the focus is not where you're falling short, because we're all falling short, but the focus is on where God's calling you.
That's right. Yeah.
And so it's not so much, hey, you lack here, but God's calling you here.
Yeah.
And I think that oftentimes our focus is more on where people lack, as opposed to how God loves them and is calling them to something more.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
No, it does. Yeah, and I'm just thinking it's almost like a difference in what the end game is in that shame or that guilt. And so I think an unhealthy way that this plays out is like, you need to do this, and stop doing this, so that you will be worthy, or so that God will accept you, as opposed to, like, you're worthy and God accepts you.
Yeah.
So let's explore, how do we best live into what God has for us. And I think that goes back to, Paul, you kind of touched on it very briefly, but I like it. So a lot of times we see this, the curses of Genesis 3 as like these curses, punishment kind of things, as opposed to, like, no, this is the way things are when we choose that way of life. And so I'm just thinking through that, man. Like, yeah, when we shame within the church, like, a lot of times it is presented as like in order to receive God's love, or in order to be considered worthy, you do this, and so we call that out, as opposed to saying, like, you're worthy and God is inviting us into something much better. So I think it's kind of, what's our end game, or our end goal in those conversations.
Can we jump down just a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Jump away.
After the fall, Adam names Eve. I think there's a connection. Shame can be a power move, and I think what you're seeing in the fall is that Adam and Eve begin to try to assert control over one another, and sometimes we do that through shame. And in the time of Jesus, that's definitely what the Pharisees would do. So, I mean, whenever they'd have these rules and people would begin to meet them, well, they just up the rules.
Yeah.
So now here's more shame, we have more control.
Yeah.
So I think there is a connection,
No doubt.
between vulnerability, control, and power, and shame. All those things are working together.
So, sorry, were you?
No.
I think it's almost a way to cover up our own shame as well. Like, I'm just thinking, this is a tough subject, and at times maybe it sounds like we're bashing the church, and that's not the goal. But the truth is like, we've gone through a period, if you follow other churches and the Christianity in America, like there's been a history over the past handful of years where like things have come out about significant leaders in the church, and I just can't help but think of like, and so sinful lifestyles or whatever, moral failures, whatever you want to call them, but like these have also been the voices saying this is what you have to do in order to be a Christian. And then it's and then like things come out and it's uncovering these significant moral failures. And I can't help but think like, is this a power control grab in order to cover up the shame? Does that make sense what I'm thinking through?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm like, it's power and control to shame other people, but like, is there also an aspect of it that is power and control that if I'm controlling other people, then my stuff stays hidden? Push back on me if you
No,
or
I
are you
think there's
totally
definitely
lost?
sometimes it can be like a bit of that shell type of a game where as long as I keep you looking here or you keep your focus here, your focus isn't on me as much. I mean, I think the other side of that is the people that have used their significant clout to preach a gospel that isn't true to make themselves feel better about the gospel that they have subscribed their life to. I mean, I think there's a significant, if I just keep saying it loud enough and keep getting enough people on board with me, then that covers up this dissonance that I'm feeling with how I'm living. And I don't know. I think there's a lot there, but I need more than a couple minutes to think about that.
Yeah, we're feeling real vulnerable right now.
Jeez.
Well, I mean, there is, I mean, all these things, you can't solve them in 45 minutes in a podcast. But I mean, I think the call is the same. The call is, okay, be authentic, be real, give space for people to be real. Mm-hmm. I think, and see, our culture doesn't practice this. Our culture practices, I mean, you see oversharing and overreacting. Mm-hmm. I mean, you see both. I mean, so somebody shares, somebody reacts, and that's how the culture is moving right now, and in the wrong direction with that. Where I believe there should be a willingness to share as opportunities there, and as it's right, and as it deepens the relationship with the other person, and it deepens your relationship with God, and with people who are slow to speak and quick to listen. I don't know. The longer I'm in this, the more listening seems to be the key to this. That the more we're willing to listen, and the slower we are to say, the better off we'll be. We're just so quick. If somebody expresses a need, we're so quick to try to meet that need with our words. Yeah. That sometimes it's the listening that's lacking.
Yeah, well, I think we also live in a time where, I mean, information is power, it's currency. And so there's an extent to which, and I want to say we don't even realize we're doing it, but like we hear and people share things with us. And it's almost like in them sharing their stories, you realize that they are giving you power. They're sometimes giving you ammunition that you could use at a later date. And so I think sometimes that takes a reframing of, as someone is sharing and being truthful and authentic and honest, to see it more as that they are giving you a gift to safeguard versus that they are just giving you this stuff to use against them. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we start to feel like I'm going to pull from it, I'm feeling better about myself because at least I know that I didn't do what that person did. Like, I just think that, sure. I don't know what I want to say there, but I don't know, I think there's a difference between using what people share as building up this ammunition and just seeing it as something to safeguard.
That's good.
I have no idea where we're at on time.
Well,
or anything
we're probably
like that,
pretty close to the end of time.
Yeah.
Not the end of time. End of time. Well, maybe close to the end of time.
That's
a whole other podcast, and we don't have a charge for that today. But at the end of the podcast.
So assuming we're approaching time because I wasn't paying attention, maybe I'd maybe just, so the truth is that people have been hurt in different relationships, and so that is an obvious obstacle to vulnerability. I don't know, maybe just some very practical ideas or encouragement to someone who has, even within the church, been vulnerable and has been hurt. How do you navigate that? How do you continue to be vulnerable while not completely ignoring what has happened? I know, Paul, you talked a little bit, I think in staff meeting, a little bit about what that looks like. So maybe just some ideas, very practical things there.
Well, forgiveness is a vulnerability practice, but it does not mean you have to be vulnerable to that person. Reconciliation is being vulnerable to the other person. So it's possible to forgive someone and be vulnerable in that forgiveness and not move back into that relationship with reconciliation and allowing the person the opportunity to hurt you again. And I think the phrase that I've used is, the question is not who, but if. So I mean, we're not called. I don't believe we're called to be vulnerable to every person. It's impossible. It's impractical. Nobody lives like that. But what happens is typically someone will hurt us and will withdraw from everyone. And so I guess just seek someone else, continue in relationship, and continue in the process. I think in this sermon I used the phrase that vulnerability is a process, and it is. It's a process, and you know, we're not expecting everybody to share their deepest, darkest secrets every time they're with someone, or when we gather in the church. But we're hoping that people develop connections, that as God reveals, as God grows, then the relationship can deepen.
That's good. Yeah, I think that's right. I like that process idea. So the truth is, well, again, with everything we try to do quick fixes, and so like, okay, the solution is just to be vulnerable with someone else. Well, like there's that process of working through that. So like take your time and figuring out who those people are that you can and you know, test the waters and dip your toe in the water a little bit, and as opposed to like just finding other people and just spilling everything out.
Well, and so you can be authentic and not overshare.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's a big difference between saying, "Hey, I'm great," when you're not great, and then sharing all the reasons you're not great.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, you begin that process with, is someone willing to begin a dialogue that's honest with me? So how are you doing? Well, not real great. You know, you'd be praying for me. There's nothing wrong with unspoken prayer requests. They are good.
No, I love it. I feel like, look for the person that when you're willing to crack just that smidge to say something like, hey, it's not been a really great week. Look for the person that presses into that with you and doesn't just pat you in the arm and say, oh, hope next week is better. Like, so I feel like if you're kind of speed dating, or you're looking for somebody who might be a good person to trust your vulnerability with, it's that person that leans in and says, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Can you tell me more about it? Or is there something this week that I can be praying for that would go better? So kind of, you can kind of test the waters out. And maybe your first moment of vulnerability with that person is to say, you know what, I'm really bad at opening up. I can't believe I just told you I had a bad week because I'm really bad. Yeah. And in the moment, showing that. Yeah. So I don't know, some things to think about.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of it. You guys watch Seinfeld?
A little grown up.
So Seinfeld, George decides Jerry's, I can't remember what's going on, but Jerry's open for George sharing to him. And so George just shares his deepest, darkest secrets. And then the next scene they show Jerry, and he's just like this. So pay attention to body language.
Yes, pay attention to that reaction. But also be wary of, like we talked about, those that offer quick fixes. Yeah, right. Like quick fixes. Like, or I'll pray for you, or hey, you should try this, or you know what? Yeah.
Because truthfully, it catches some of us off guard when somebody responds. You expect, like, the social contract is, how are you? Good. Okay, good. How are you doing? For sure. So there are times when it catches me off guard when I'm like, when
someone's not like, great.
That person didn't answer. They were great. But in my mind, I already started to move on in the conversation. So I think there's a practice, even don't be the one to offer the quick fix.
That's good.
I always remember there's a guy playing basketball at St. Paul's Nazarene in Kansas City, and he fell and he broke his arm, so he wasn't okay. But somebody said, are you okay? You know, when you're an athlete, you always say, yeah, I'm okay. he went, no. And we laughed about it because he's just like, no, my arm's broke, dude. Leave me alone.
That's great. That's great.
If your arm's broke, say it's broke.
Yeah. Stop trying to hide it. No. So just let's wrap this up. Any thoughts for kids, teens, what this looks like for us?
Man, one of my favorite quotes, I think it's Frederick Douglass. If it's not, just somebody tell me. But it's on my wall. But it's the whole idea that it's easier to build up a child than repair an adult. And when the whole time I've been sitting here thinking about this, I've been thinking my kids, and a lot of the other kids are right in that prime age of starting to really understand feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, feelings of wanting to hide themselves, not just from me, but also from God. And I've just been kind of racking my brain thinking about what are practices, what are things that we can be using in our family to actively work against that innate feeling of needing to hide. Like I think of times when I can tell my kids don't want to talk about something, and it's tempting just to be like, okay, fine. If they just go to their room, like they'll just come out in 15 minutes and everything will be fine and they'll be better. And I'm trying to be more, pushing into that a little bit more and say, okay, it's fine. You don't want to talk about it right now, but I want to talk about it later. So you pick the time, you pick the place, but like I do want to talk about this. And so I feel like when we let our kids start to pull away and hide from us just as their parents, we're losing ground to in their feelings of control that they can pull away and hide from God. And so I just think it's really important to be aware of this idea that a kid that doesn't want to talk about something, I think you really want to unpack that and find a way to not let them escape into that inner, I don't know, just that like when the shame is too much and they don't want you to look at them, they don't want you like, that's what Adam and Eve felt. They're hiding from God in a garden. And he's like, where are you? And they're like, well, we didn't want you to see us. Like, that's how our kids are feeling. And sometimes it's over silly things like they spilled the milk in the kitchen. But they will run and hide. And so I just think we need to see that is a visible showing of what we do in response to shame.
Yeah, that's good. I think as you're saying, kids are starting to feel that shame and whatnot. I would say for teenagers, like this is the time where they're starting to feel the repercussions of being vulnerable. How many countless times have we heard, like, I thought she was my best friend or whatever, and then she, and so I think teenagers are just that's the time where they start really being vulnerable, and then unfortunately that leads to hurt, and so I don't even know what to. I guess my encouragement there is just to, and so as parents, like helping our teens to think through who is in your kind of inner circle. Like, who is it that you are allowing yourself to be vulnerable to? And I guess, so maybe that's just a kind of a protective kind of thing. Like, we can speak into that. Not that we control everything and who they're with, but like we can have those kind of training conversations of like understanding that when we're vulnerable, like there is, by definition, being vulnerable opens yourself up to this hurt. And so let's talk about who are we vulnerable with, who's in our inner circle. And I also think that provides us with significant opportunities to respond and react when that hurt does happen, that we can kind of model something going forward, because the truth is the hurt doesn't stop when we're teenagers, right? And so if that's a training ground of where we can shape that, like, and set them on a trajectory when they are adults and they experience that, when maybe they're in a church and they experience that, like they've been given a blueprint, if you will, to on how to navigate that.
Do you think there's also a piece in there of challenging our kids to be the kids that are safe to be vulnerable with?
Yes, absolutely.
Like, because it's like, if you didn't like that happened to you, well, then don't you be the person who did that to somebody else.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's an accountability there with our kids.
For sure. Yeah, that's good.
And I would say this as somebody that's seen kids and teens. That's why it's important. As kids, it's easier to do those things, to be empathetic with them and show them God's love. it's kind of a weird thing as they become teenagers.
Yeah.
They accept that far less from mom and dad,
Yeah.
and so that's why it's important they're in youth groups. And they're around other adults that model that, because they begin to see, because you don't always see that in the school. So hopefully in our youth group with our small groups and with Josh and his other leaders, they are able to see others other than their parents
Right. For sure.
that model that and demonstrate that. So
sure.
that, not that it's not important, they're not here as kids, because we model that in our children's department, but as they grow into teenagers, I think it's almost natural they disconnect, or I don't know if they disconnect, they begin to say, well, that's mom and dad.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, but no, the hope in the kids department is that they're making those friendships that grow with them to youth group,
Good.
and
For
sure.
that becomes
For sure.
their. Yeah, I was reading a thing today earlier this week, and it just said like, what if the best way for our kids to truly know God is to spend time around other people who know God, and like just this idea of that. Yeah, if you're an adult, you're feeding into our children, our teens, just by being around them.
Yeah.
Because discipleship it's not just that, oh, this concentrated time this year, it's the walking in together.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. Good. Cool. Well, want to pray? Unless you guys have anything else profound to speak. All right. God, thank you so much for this day, this conversation. God, most of all, thank you for your love for us. And thank you that you see us as worthy. Maybe not deserving, not something that we've earned, but just because you created us, you've counted us worthy. And so we thank you for that. God, would you help us to live lives of vulnerability? Give us discernment in where to be vulnerable and who to be vulnerable with. And God, I pray that as we do that, relationships will be strengthened, connections will be strengthened, even here within our church. A culture of vulnerability and growth and relationships will thrive. God, thank you again for your love, for your grace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, guys.